Amanda, I'm so excited to interview you. I have been a great fan of your podcast, not just me, but all my girls. You know how many saunas I've sat in where we've been listening to, it sounds like a cult, and going, oh my gosh, all these things. So congrats on a fantastic podcast. I'm very excited to interview you, and congratulations on your new book.
And that's nice.
Magical Overthinking.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that. Thank you.
Of course. Okay, so I'm going to just grab a couple of things that I've got lots of little dog ears here. I like really getting into books of the people that I interview. And what really caught my attention was something on page 6 that you said, the Zen Buddhist and the word koan. I think I'm saying it correctly.
Yeah.
It's the unsolvable riddle. You break the mind in order to reveal deeper truths and reassemble the pieces to create something new. And that was, for me, beautiful, because a lot of the work I've been doing, and I still research and run clinical trials, all kinds of things, and it's looking at the mind and how the mind is not the brain, and how the mind changes the brain and things get broken down, and all the influences that come into us, and how the biases our perceptions. And then you write this book all about pretty much biasing perceptions and how our mind can, do what it's, get very influenced by the language of the day. So great book, great. And I'm excited to start talking to you about this. Can you just, first of all, tell people a little bit more about you and about your book? And I know you've written a few books.
I am a writer, but my background is in linguistics. That's what my undergraduate degree is in. My whole life have always been fascinated by the relationships between language and identity, language and power, the way that words affect the way that we move through the world, and vice versa. And so my first 2 books, which are called Wordslut and Cultish, are a little bit more sociolinguistics-y. They're like a fun, quick and dirty crash course to language and gender, and then an exploration of the language of cults from Scientology to SoulCycle. So I like to write about social science from a kind of nerdy language perspective, but also in a way that's very colloquial and fun and voicey for the general reader who might not otherwise pick up a social science book, and certainly not a linguistic book. But as I was researching my last book, Cultish, I naturally was looking into papers that were discussing the mechanics of cult influence. And I came across many mentions of cognitive biases like confirmation bias and sunk cost fallacy, which are some of the better known biases, and the role that those psychological shortcuts played in folks' decisions to stay in cults for longer than could make sense to anyone, including and especially themselves. But I couldn't help but notice how those cognitive biases also serve to justify so many of my own irrational choices that I could never before explain, as well as many of the irrationalities I was noticing in the zeitgeist at large, from, extreme cycles of celebrity worship and dethronement to embrace of Instagram manifestation gurus to these sort of, mass obsessions with nostalgia, weaponized nostalgia in politics. There seem to be more delulu than ever in society, despite living in the information age. And so the idea for that book was kind of rooted in this fundamental question, why living in the information age does the world only seem to be making less sense? And as I read more about cognitive biases, I sort of came up with this theory that this clash between our innate human superstitions and, irrational decision-making strategies that once served us very well, they're clashing with the information age, and with an excess of information, with, mass loneliness, with this sort of capitalistic pressure to know everything under the sun. And so that sort of planted the seed for this book, which is about cognitive biases in the digital age.
I love it. What a great walk through the basic concepts. And so important, because we do get so swayed by so much stuff. And I love the fact that you spoke about the linguistics. I did linguistics 30 years ago. It was one of the subjects we had to do when I did the degree that I did. So yeah, it's just, language is just massive, and it changes all the time, and I know you touch on that, but how, I just remember this there as a clinician, you were allowed to say one thing, and then like 10 years later or 5 years later, you can't say that, that's bad. Now you've got to describe it like this. And that's just how things change. And it's so important, because language, how you use language, definitely does work. I love that. I think it's really important. So you talk about so many different things. What I'd love to do? I'd love to start with a story of you getting stuck in that relationship for 7 years, and how the love bombing. And so that's a great start, because this is a podcast about mind and choices we make and mental health and that kind of thing and relationships. And you use that to explain some really great concepts, things like love bombing and whatever. Can we start there? Just tell the story and
Yes.
And you're so good at this. Just take it weird once.
Okay, sorry, 1 second. I'm going to wait for a helicopter to pass. I live in Los Angeles where there's a lot of helicoptering happening. Yeah, of course. Well, this is the most personal chapter in the book, and it's the one that's sort of probably most directly correlated to the subject matter of the book that I wrote about cult language, because as I was researching that book, I was asking myself, how could you fall for a cult leader and stay 20 years in Scientology or something like that? And then as I began reading into the cognitive bias that serves as the theme for that chapter, the sunk cost fallacy, I realized that same bias that could explain so much of this cult behavior could also explain my own irrational decision to stay in a very, as it turns out, cult-like one-on-one relationship for many, many years. And so many of the same techniques of influence that were at play in the cults that I was researching also had an effect on me in that romantic relationship. It just, went by a different name, like in a cult atmosphere, something that might be called love bombing would in, age gap sort of power abusive relationship like the one that I was in might be called grooming. In a cult atmosphere, something might be called financial exploitation that in a romantic relationship would be called domestic theft. The labeling is different, but the techniques of influence are very much the same. And when those combine with our innate cognitive biases, which allow us to make decisions in a way that is good enough normally, but not always, it can be kind of catastrophic. So that chapter of the book is called A Toxic Relationship is Just a Cult of One, a note on the sunk cost fallacy, which describes our tendency to believe that resources already spent on an endeavor justify spending even more. So this fallacy is often discussed in the context of economics or finances. It's this idea that you're at a poker table and you've already put, $5,000 on the table. And even though you have a bad hand, you figure like, I'm this far in, I can't give up now. I might as well just go all in, even though you should probably just cut your losses and go out. And this applies to, really low stakes arenas of life. Like when you are 100 episodes into a TV show and you've decided you don't even really like it and you would probably like to stop watching it, but you're so invested in all these characters and you're like, oh my God, I'm already halfway in. I have to keep continuing on like that. That's sort of the most low stakes version of this principle. But I found that after I got out of this 7-year relationship, which really did not serve me and which I just not my best self in any way whatsoever. For years, I beat myself up asking myself, how could I have been so deluded, into telling myself that a win was just around the corner or that the promises originally made in this relationship were sure to come true, even though the pattern suggested that things were only getting worse and worse. And as it turned out, this sunk cost fallacy practice or tendency was very much at play the way that it is at play in so many cult scenarios. We as human beings are extremely loss averse. We don't like to look defeats in the eye. We don't like to admit that we've made a bad bet on life, particularly when that bet is about ourselves. It's embarrassing enough to make a bad bet at the poker table, but it can feel really shameful to make a bad bet on your own happiness or on decisions that you thought would bring you joy and comfort and fulfillment and all of those things. And so I came across this really fascinating paper that was written by a philosopher named Ryan Duty, kind of unfortunate last name. But regardless, I came across this really fascinating paper that suggested that the sunk cost fallacy is perhaps not so much of an irrational fallacy at all in the way that, we as human beings are extremely, oriented toward collaboration and social connection. And in order to, make a good impression that would invite other people to be on your team in the game of life, so to speak, you're going to want to create a positive impression of your decision-making track record. You're going to want to create this impression that you know yourself well, that you can make, good bets on yourself, that you are predictable to yourself. And that will make you seem, dependable and reliable and like someone that other people would want in their corner. If you are constantly making bets on yourself that turn out not to be good ones. You could paint yourself as, the villain in the story of your life or the village idiot. And that might not make you look very attractive to other people's social circles. And so, even though that is not sort of an excuse for the sunk cost fallacy, informing your decisions to stay in negative relationships, it is an explanation. And it just shows that we are these, deeply social, relationally oriented beings who, want sort of beautiful stories to be written about us. I found that, we want the choices that we make in life to feel like well-plotted films. We want to feel like we've planted seeds that sprout into blooms later on. We don't want to feel like life is unpredictable and unmanageable. And so if constantly justifying a bad choice to yourself will make your life feel more manageable, in addition to making you seem more, attractive socially to others in your circle, then, it doesn't make you seem like the ding dong that I certainly thought I was. And so learning about how this cognitive bias informs our decisions really helped me understand my choices, forgive them, and also identify when the sunk cost fallacy is misinforming me moving forward.
The key thing was making choices. So you recognizing now, linking that back to the magical thinking aspect there was this whole thing of, I did grass with greener, and I've invested this time. I can't just give up. There's something good. There must be something good. I must be missing something. And all those, that's the magical thinking that you're talking about. Am I correct in understanding you? That we can get ourselves so caught up in it that we stay in things and we make wrong decisions.
That's right. Well, I guess I should back up maybe and kind of define magical overthinking a little bit.
Yeah.
Let's do that. Yeah. So magical thinking all on its own is a pretty well-known subject or concept. And it's this idea that your internal thoughts can affect external events. So if you just, manifest hard enough, then you can yield wealth and attractiveness and love or whatever it is that you desire.
Doesn't quite work like that, does it? But that's what
quite work like that. I mean, of course, your attitude, your mindset can influence outcomes, but it doesn't quite work like a magic trick. And yet, during times of incredible tumult or chaos or pain, we start to think more magically as a way to regain some agency. And so I argue in the book that while magical thinking is a sort of age-old cognitive quirk, overthinking is distinct to the modern era. Again, it is this clash between our psychological shortcuts, the mental magic tricks that we've always played on ourselves in order to make sense of the world enough to survive it, in sort of negative combination with the culture that we've created that is so digitally oriented. And, I would not take back the democratization of information. I think it's wonderful that we have access to more knowledge than ever before, but it is overwhelming these, imperfect algorithms that our brains have come up with. And so, yeah, magical overthinking it manifests in so many different ways. So the way that magical overthinking showed up in this relationship was, for example, during the most painful moments when, the sunk cost fallacy was really kicking in, I thought to myself, I think I'll post the happiest photos of us online. That will really turn this whole thing around. And there is more pressure than ever, I would argue, in the age of social media to create a positive impression of your decisions and your life, to make it look like a movie that was written by an Oscar winner, because we are ostensibly in the judgiest era of all time when, in theory, limitless eyeballs could look at your choices and make you feel like a village idiot. So that was one example. Another study that I came across while researching that chapter, which I feel like really represents magical overthinking or this collision between our natural cognitive biases and the modern era, had to do with additive versus subtractive solutions. So I came across this fascinating study that you probably remember, where study participants were presented with a puzzle involving colored blocks, and they could solve the problem by either adding or subtracting colored blocks from the little visual puzzle. And the vast majority of participants decided to solve the problem by adding colored blocks, even though the much more efficient, less cumbersome solution would just be to take one single color block away. But almost no one thought of that. We as human beings naturally, but surely those of us growing up in consumerist society, think that to solve a problem, you need to add a bunch of variables to an equation, whether you're talking about colored blocks or a bad relationship. During the worst moments of that relationship, I thought to myself, what we need to do? We need to go on another vacation or get another cat. or replace all our furniture. We need to, apply some additive solution. Or I need to post more photos of us online. That will fix it. When the much more efficient solution, again, would have been perhaps to take stock of everything that I already had and perhaps scale back, take something away, break up. But it never occurred to me because we are living in the extremely consumerist age that we are living in. And we're also oriented toward these additive solutions. We do not like to scale back. We don't like to give things up. We don't like to admit to ourselves that we made a bad bet and lost. So that was, sort of one way that I was applying these cognitive biases in a way that was a little bit more personal. Because again, they're normally discussed in sort of like a dry academic context, which I love reading about anyway. But I thought that, it would sort of personalize the subject matter to involve it in a more zeitgeisty and intimate context.
Great, because it helps people get the gist of the whole thing. And so from there, you mentioned about the magical thinking, the manifestation, and I can't remember that influencer, which chapter is it that you talk about the whole psychological, get your therapy online. And I mean, this has been worrying me for years. I mean, I'm 38 years in this field and I'm 60 years old and I'm watching what's going on with all this therapy online and the trauma concept creeps and all these things. And it's very worrying. And you talk about that and you talk about how closely it's linked to conspiracy theories. It was really fascinating. Do you want to talk about that chapter?
Thank you. Sure. Yeah. So chapter 2 of the book is called I Swear I Manifested This. And the theme of that chapter is a cognitive bias called proportionality bias, which describes our penchant to think that big events or even just big feelings must have had a big cause. And this is the bias that underlies most nefarious conspiratorial thinking. It's this idea that the global pandemic could not have been the result of a bunch of small, random, freak accidents all adding up together. That doesn't make proportional sense. It was this giant global calamity. A government must have engineered it on purpose. The only way that big of an effect could have happened by having a huge cause. Or another, classic canonical conspiracy theory example would be, Princess Diana's death. That could not have just been an accident, a coincidence. It was too big a tragedy. The royal family must have killed her. So that sort of misattribution of cause and effect is conspiratorial, but I argue that ideas of manifestation are their own kind of conspiracy theory because it's sort of the flip side of this idea that some, big evil, or in this case, toxically positive force has your future in its hands. Like the universe could either be for you or against you. And in the way that, the government engineered COVID-19, you with your thoughts and your crystals and your vision board can engineer a better future for yourself. It has nothing to do with systemic inequities or dumb luck. Like you and you alone control your destiny. And, again, there is like a grain of truth to the idea that your mindset can influence outcomes. So but during the global pandemic, those ideas of manifestation were really appealing to people because it was a time when, there was incredible turbulence. We did not feel like we were in control. And so while on one end of the political spectrum, although I would argue that it's really more of a circle, people were embracing, really hardcore and pernicious conspiracy theories. There were also people who were embracing the flood of manifestation gurus that were entering social media spaces. You would find influencers. The one that I report on in this chapter goes by the Manifestation Doctor. That is a pseudonym because she's a little scary. But there were so many influencers like her that I've termed conspiracy therapists who would sort of combine those misattributions of cause and effect, that proportionality bias, with therapy language alongside sort of new age ideas that like you and you alone can control your destiny with crystals and the law of attraction. And they use this combination of factors to create incredible profit for themselves. And while for, most followers, this was relatively harmless, it was, a positive thing in many ways, this idea that you can take some of this lack of control back into your, let me go back. It was this idea that you can, take some of this chaos back under your control and you can engage in some rituals that will make you feel better. Some took it to a really dogmatic place, and that sent many not many, but a disturbing number of folks down a much scarier conspiratorial rabbit hole into QAnon territory because their proportionality bias was already right there setting them up to do so. So yeah, this sort of like marriage between kind of like new agey therapy spaces and QAnon conspiracy therapy or conspiracy theory spaces, they have more overlap than you might think because of our innate biases about cause and effect.
Yeah, it's fascinating that, and it was actually quite scary to watch that, the whole secret and the whole, I'm in psychoneurobiology, and your mind influences your brain. What your mind drives everything, but it's not the situation of I can imagine, I'm seeing this and I can make it manifest in my life in the vision board. It doesn't work like that. It just means that your mind works through your brain and your body, and your brain and your body respond. But it's, and then you're going to go through all the challenges and ups and downs of life. But this thing, that's my vision board. I'm going to stick it on the fridge and I'm going to read it 10 times a day and I'm going to believe it's coming to me. That is ridiculous. But yes, it really did rise to quite a height over that period, and before as well. I mean, I've seen this in religious circles. It's a big thing in religious circles as well. And I know you've done a podcast on that as well in your It's a Cult podcast. So that was really great. Let's talk about the zero-sum game, because that's another thing that people throw that word out all the time. And I do like how you handled that chapter.
Yeah. So zero-sum bias is another one of these cognitive inclinations that usually is discussed in the context of economics, but I really wanted to discuss it in the context of social comparison and how it can cause, these intense compare despair feelings on social media among so many people, but especially young women. So the zero-sum bias is our tendency to think that another person's gain inherently means your loss. So another person's wealth, coolness, beauty puts your wealth, coolness, and beauty at stake or at risk. It threatens it, when that's really not the case. There is, not a limited quantity of coolness or beauty in the world. But when we come across so many accounts and, illusory identities online, we are not built to, triangulate an identity amidst all of those accounts. And so it creates this, incredible despair, because we're looking at these other people and we're, basing those conclusions on a truly like ancient instinct where, there was once a time in human history when we would clock other individuals in our communities who are similar in age to us and of the same sex. And we really would be in material direct competition with them for, things like mates and food. But now so many resources are more abstract, disembodied, and not limited in quantity at all. And yet those instincts are still really deep within us. And it's to the point where, during times of, again, crisis and when it feels like, we're very out of control across the political spectrum, attitudes toward immigration start to feel more zero-sum. Studies have shown that, most folks, no matter their politics, believe that the government can't help one population without harming another, even though that isn't true. In, economic terms, it's found in study after study that people think that like sellers and buyers can't both benefit equally from a transaction, even though that is like so counter to how trade and commerce actually works. But we have this really deeply ingrained what's called win-win denial, where we don't think that is possible, even though in today's age, that's actually more possible than ever. Like it's more possible than ever to collaborate with people who are similar to you in a way that can benefit everyone. And yet our instincts, our zero-sum instincts, are so deep-rooted and so deleterious that, these social comparison attitudes are causing incredible, mental health detriments, particularly in young women who are found to make more upward social comparisons and downward identification. So when young women scroll through their feed, they'll tend to only notice the women that they perceive as superior and thus threatening to them. And that really takes a toll on their self-esteem. So those were some of the ideas that I explored in that chapter, in addition to some sort of techniques or, mindset shifts to combat those instincts.
Beautifully explained. Can you give a couple of those mindset shifts? Can you explain a couple of them?
Sure. Well, in 2013, there was this brilliant piece in The Cut written by the writers Aminatou Sow and Anne Friedman, where the term shine theory was coined. And I think about this all the time, but basically this idea that, with I'm no physicist, but I believe the way that light works is that if you are burning bright and I am burning bright, when with our light combined, everyone burns brighter, and that, someone else's light does not dim me just because they exist. And so I've tried to keep that in mind. And so how I apply this in a sort of actionable way is that, when I personally come across someone on social media who appears to threaten me because they're, a woman similar in age to me, who's also a writer, who, maybe really doing well and went to a fancy school and has all these qualities that feel like they're putting my success at risk. Instead of allowing her to sort of live rent free in my head and make me feel bad about myself, I've been trying instead to, slide into her DMs, so to speak, and express a sincere message of congratulations about her career. And if we live in the same town, or if I'm going to be traveling to where she lives at any point in the future, I offer to get coffee. And it has been amazing that, almost all of the time I will receive a heartfelt message where they'll be like, oh my gosh, I'm such an admirer of you. Or like, maybe they'll just say like, thank you. That really means a lot to me. It's hard out here. And I have met I swear to God, I have met some of my dearest friends this way. People who I couldn't imagine being their nemesis or their imagined illusory nemesis, because again, with our light combined, we burn brighter, as sort of corny as that sounds. And so that has really relieved me of a lot of suffering, because the instinct is there. That zero-sum instinct is there. It happens all the time. When I come across someone online who is beautiful and brilliant and wears cool leather jackets, I'm just like, oh my God, I suck and I don't dress cool. And, it feels really threatening. But almost every single time I am able to push past that and tap follow and make a connection rather than an enemy. And that has been really profound for me.
I love that, because you also give the example of the Japanese culture, where they're so focused toward, on collectivism and community versus individualism of the very dominant individualism in the Western world. And there's a concept that I always teach, which is why that section would really appeal to me as well, on enhancement. And the science shows, for the whole psychoneurobiological thing, exactly what you're saying. The more you enhance someone else, the more you celebrate someone else in an authentic way, the more you're going to actually improve your own mental health, your own intelligence, your own creativity, your own community. You prove that. I mean, you prove that by, as you said, some of your greatest friends. You couldn't imagine them being your nemesis. They will become your greatest friend. But you made a choice to enhance versus compete. And yet we live in this culture of really, really bad magical thinking, or we've got to compete because that there is some fallacy. So there's some bias. So that was really one that I really enjoyed. I enjoyed all of them. As you can see, I'm just up my street, this stuff. So good, great job. A great job.
Yeah, no, something that you're saying reminds me of something else that I learned while writing that chapter, the concept of spontaneous trait transference. That chapter is called the shit talking hypothesis, which is kind of a cheeky chapter title. But I learned while writing it that when we disparage other people as an attempt to, gain a leg over them or something, or gain an edge on them, that only serves to make us look bad in the eyes of our interlocutor, not the person that we're shit talking. So, if I feel threatened by someone and I go to a friend of mine, I'm like, oh, this person, she's not even that funny, or, she's not even that cool. All of a sudden I will start to look not all that funny and not all that cool. And so that's not an invitation for people to adopt some kind of like toxically positive attitude where, we're not allowed to vent, or we're not allowed to, talk out our negative emotions or anything like that. But it's just sort of an invitation to consider that cycle between, competitiveness, zero-sum bias, trash talk, especially among women, because obviously patriarchy sets up a very particular zero-sum game for women. And so, I think about spontaneous trait transference a lot, because whenever I feel that impulse to, shit talk someone who I feel like jealous of in some way, I remember that reflects badly on no one but me.
I love that. I love the authenticity, and it's very freeing what you're saying. And it's, as you say, you're not trying to suppress someone. Sometimes you have to talk about what you're going through, what someone has done, but that's more from an experiential thing that you've gone through, or you've observed, or you've seen them do something. But when what you're talking about is the fact that if someone is maybe potentially a threat to how you see yourself or your work, then trash talking, that's just going to backfire. And so I'm really glad you brought that up. You also, I think it's your first chapter where you talk about your relationship with your mom, who's this real superstar, perfect mom who scientist and going to save us all from cancer and saved yourself from cancer. I mean, really amazing. And you end off with the most amazing paragraph at the end of I can read it, but you can share it. And I'm a mom of 4 and they're all adult children. And, I read that and I thought, wow, that really freed me. So I have to tell you that. So it was great.
Oh.
That chapter and your mom and, what you got out of it. Because I think a lot of moms will benefit from what you're about to.
Yeah, well, so this chapter is called Are You My Mother, Taylor Swift? And it sort of talks about this one particular bias that is responsible for the sort of larger than life admiration that we've grown to have of celebrities, but also the larger than life expectations that we have of our own parents. And those expectations are, becoming more intertwined as celebrities come to fulfill an almost surrogate parental role in the lives of so many young people who feel disconnected from their real life parental figures and their real life communities. So this bias is called the halo effect, and it describes our tendency to admire one quality in a person and jump to the conclusion that they must be perfect overall. So the original subjects of the halo effect were our parental figures and community leaders. So many of us tend to view our parents as infallible when we're young, and then we come to realize at some point during our adolescence or our coming of age that our parents are in fact not perfect. Some people are unfortunately forced to confront this reality sooner than others, but that can create some tension, and that is important to work through because the halo effect stems from this image where, a picture, a Renaissance painting where an angel is like bathing under a crown of light and they seem perfect, but also the background is obscured because of the way that the light is distributed. And so when someone has a halo, if it's your mother, let's say, and my mother definitely did growing up, you can't see the scope of their humanity. You can't see the background of the painting. You can't see the things that make them a 360, complex human being. And in, patriarchal society, the halo effect especially affects women who just have, farther to fall. We lift them up onto a higher pedestal, which eliminates their complexity and their scope for their humanity. And so, I really struggled with the halo effect and my mom growing up because I really saw her as perfect. My friends' moms were mostly single moms who were really, really human. Like the halo effect didn't apply to them quite as much. They, came home from their jobs at like 3 p.m. and they cursed and they talked about poop and, they were just so human. And my mom was, she is this brilliant scientist who is a cancer cell biologist, and she, has won so many awards, and she always had such a perfect blowout, and she was an amazing cook. And this is like not a complaint, to have like such an amazing mother, but it was a lot to live up to. And it certainly made me perceive her as perfect. And so, when she would do things that disappointed me or that were literally just human, I would punish her gravely. But we were able to work through that because she was my actual real life mother. And we were able to kind of, use empathy tools to mend that relationship. Not like it was ever all that damaged, but the halo effect really played a role invisibly in our relationship. But interestingly, the halo effect is also playing, a much more uncanny role in the dynamics between particularly female celebrities and their intense fans. Because when you uplift a celebrity as perfect, you like a pop star's music, so you jump to the conclusion that they must be worldly and nurturing, and they must care about you as much as you care about them, and they have the same politics as you and all of that. They will invariably disappoint you because they are just human. And yet you don't have that empathetic, parent-child relationship to help you work through it. And so the dynamics can become really hallucinatory and really brutal. And I was just fascinated by the sort of mother role that so many celebrities, female celebrities, are playing in the lives of fans these days, and saw some of those dynamics in my own relationship with my mom.
I found that very interesting, the way you did that comparison or that sort of link. And it is so true because I've spoken to quite a few, Hailey Bieber and Kate Walsh, and there's quite a lot of people that are got a big following, and they they're aware of this, and it really affects them as well. And yes, you think, oh, well, they're famous and wonderful and got everything. Why should they have any cares in the world? But it does, it works both ways, because it puts people, it kind of steals something from both sides. And you commented in your book about someone who sent you I think it was 3,000 pages or something 3,000 something, or something on Taylor Swift's whole, or something. I can't quite remember the detail. It just lets people get in criticizing and judging and taking that humanity out. So the halo effect is a brilliant way of explaining that. I wouldn't have thought of that before.
Well, the moment I came across these studies on the halo effect, I recognized it in, the dynamics between Taylor Swift and her Swifties. And again, I was the unhinged Swiftie to my mother's Taylor Swift, no doubt about it. But, to kind of like bring that chapter home, I remember discussing with a friend of mine the concept of the good enough mother, which was coined by the English psychologist Donald Winnicott. And this idea that, like, in theory, even if there were the perfect mother who made no mistakes, that would set up their child to be, extremely fragile, sensitive, unable to cope with even minor life problems. And so really all a mother needs to be is good enough. And so I came to think, like, that must apply to celebrities as well. Like, perhaps we just need our celebrity mothers, so to speak, to be good enough, because to worship them on the level of a god is just as dehumanizing as it is to objectify them.
Oh, absolutely. And I'm glad you mentioned that, because it was one of my questions that I wanted to bring up, and I nearly forgot to. So I'm so glad you brought that up. That's just not just good enough. It's fantastic, because it does bring an authenticity. All of us can just be good enough and keep trying, and not to, we can be kinder to ourselves and kinder to others, which is a lot of what that brings us to. Well, Amanda, there's so many fun things to talk about still. A couple more questions. Let's just take one more question, because I know your time is precious too. How do you suggest individuals navigate the fine line between embracing intuition and avoiding magical thinking?
Well, I don't think we really can avoid magical thinking, because it is so deeply embedded. And unfortunately, there are some cognitive biases where even an awareness of them will not mitigate them. Like the illusory truth effect is one that comes to mind, that our tendency to believe that something must be true just because we've heard it multiple times. And even knowing that bias exists doesn't mean that we can really combat it. We can just use what we know about the illusory truth effect to continue to repeat true information and kind of fight fire with fire. So yeah, I don't think that we can really resist magical thinking completely.
Yeah, that's a difficult one, because of social media and the way people can just say what they want, and multiple times, well, it's all over the place. It must be true. Not true. Someone can say one thing and some myth, it's not incorrect, but it can be spread across so fast. So even more of an issue now with
Absolutely.
technology.
Oh my gosh, yes. But that said, we also can repeat true information ad nauseum as well. So it's not just the sort of shameless disinformers who get to take advantage of that. But yeah, sort of navigating that push-pull between head and heart, so to speak, logos and pathos, that is a lifelong journey that I will be on for sure. I certainly don't have the answer, but I think, like, constantly asking ourselves the question is really important. I think moving through life knowing that multiple truths can exist at once, and that you don't have to be like entirely a magical, intuitive, divine, feminine being who rejects, like hard facts. Like, you can be both. We can be so many things. And I think, constantly challenging myself to be more compassionate toward others' irrationalities and skeptical of my own is just like a daily journey that I continue to be on forever, I think.
You've made a very good point there, because it was something I wanted to ask you as well, as what do you want readers to take away? And I think you kind of said that, is to be on that daily journey of questioning, where is this a bias that I have in me towards it? Talk a little bit more about that what would you love your readers to take away from, we said so many great things. You said so many great things today.
Yeah. Well, I found researching the book that we're really quite bad at changing other people's minds, but we're all right at changing our own. And so sort of like having the curiosity and humility to know that you can change your own mind without sort of betraying anyone, and that it's okay to interrogate ideas and that we don't have to sort of succumb to the us versus them thinking that I wrote about in this book, but also my last book. As we continue to move through the information age, that will continue to become like our major task in life, as survival and avoiding, saber-toothed tiger attacks becomes less and less our major life concern. Sort of navigating cognitive dissonance becomes more of our modern day challenge.
That's really good. Being our modern day challenge, I really like that. That's the main point that you make there. Fantastic. Well, where can we more about you, your podcast, your book, and everything?
Yeah. Thank you. Well, you can buy The Age of Magical Overthinking wherever you buy books. It's also an audiobook, and I narrated myself, so that was super joyful for me. And then I do host a weekly podcast called Sounds Like a Cult. And I just launched a podcast to go with this book called Magical Overthinkers. And I've been having the best time making that show. Every episode is like overthinking about blank, overthinking about blank, overthinking about blank. Some confounding, buzzy subject that's living rent-free in our brains. So yeah, that's me and my stuff.
That some buzzy subject living over rent-free in your brain is amazing, because we have there's some little bit of science for you here. We have an unconscious mind, which never stops working. It's 24/7. It's beyond space and time. And it is our best friend, and it spans the environment, and basically 95% of the environment's going into our mind is not our brain, is going into the unconscious mind, and the unconscious mind scans and then sends us warning signals through the subconscious into the conscious mind. And so when you talk about what you teach in this book and talk about in this book about being questioning all these things that are coming up, you really are tuning into a very scientific concept where you are tuning into the unconscious mind and listening to, hey, what's just gone in? Because a certain amount we will neutralize on an unconscious level, but we've got to consciously work on the other things. And that's what you do. This book is a great tool to find those kinds of things that we've absorbed without realizing that are affecting us, and to make a change, especially the negative. So,
well, I love that you put it that way. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for joining me today. That was great fun, and I look forward to talking again. And good luck with all the podcasts. I'll be hearing you on your podcast for sure.
Thank you so much.